Good evening. The hour of the meeting having arrived, we will call this meeting to order. And good afternoon. I'm going to read the call, which is as follows. The Housing Committee shall meet to continue discussions on the Affordable Housing Overlay District and other related matters. Tonight, the Housing Committee is meeting to continue our discussion on the proposed Affordable Housing Overlay District. At our last meeting on March 5th, the Community Development Department walked us through a presentation to better explain what this proposed Affordable Housing Overlay District would seek to achieve and how it would work. Tonight, this committee, the Housing Committee of the City Council, has asked that the CDD present the actual zoning language, meaning the language that will form the basis of what the City Council could eventually be asked to vote on. In just a few minutes, CDD will walk us through the zoning language. I will then like to hear the thoughts of many of the members of the Housing Committee and other councilors that are here about the proposal. We will then open the floor to questions and after the CDD speaks, we'll have members of the Affordable Housing Trust talk about the proposal, and then we'll open the floor to questions and comments from committee members or vice versa, and then we will follow with the public comment. In recognition of the fact that we're trying to digest this quite a bit of information this evening, and I know it's difficult for people to truly process this information, gather their thoughts, and then immediately turn around and give public comment, I do want to alert folks to the schedule of meetings that are ahead of us. On April 9th at 5:30, the mayor has scheduled a roundtable to the full city council where we can sit down and roll up our sleeves and do a deep dive into the proposed overlay district language. Since there is no public comment at roundtables, the Housing Committee will hold another hearing on April 16th at 6 p.m., and this shall be given entirely over to public comment. So if what you don't get to say this evening, you'll have an opportunity to speak on the record on April 16th at 6 p.m. On April 25th at 6 p.m., we'll hold another meeting on the Affordable Housing Overlay, the Housing Committee of the City Council, and it is my hope that we might be able to vote this on to the Ordinance Committee for further hearings at that time. Again, my original hope and expectation was that the committee would have received the zoning language a little earlier, but now that we do finally have it in front of us, my co-chair, it's been a long day, I apologize. My co-chair and I are committed to moving this conversation forward with as much deliberation, transparency, and public engagement. With as much deliberancy, transparency, and public engagement. With expeditiousness and as possible, and I want to thank everyone, particularly the members of the public, for remaining so engaged and so understanding throughout this lengthy process. I'm going to, if my co-chair would like to say a few remarks, I will allow her, she will make her for a few remarks. We should go around the table so everyone will know in the audience who is sitting here, after which we will hear from the Community Development Department. Madam Co-Chair.
Thank you. I look forward to the discussion today. If there's a lot of themes that have emerged in the last few weeks on specific areas, whether it's what are we doing about retail, what are we doing about the setbacks, what do those look like. So I think now that we have some language before us, we also have this Q&A that I also just seeing that answers some questions, but I think there's a long way to go before we get to a place that everyone is comfortable with and okay with. So I look for the discussion. I have questions, but I will do introductions and then we can go from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. Just so everyone will know, we have received at least 17 pieces of information that will be a part of the record. When we get to public comment and when we have public testimony, anything that you have written, please leave and it'll become part of the record. If it is an email form, if you email the information to the deputy clerk by midnight, it will become a part of the permanent record. Again, this is my co-chair, Sumbul Siddiqui. I am Councilor Denise Simmons, and to my left is
Neil Alpert, Office of Councilor Simmons.
Dennis Carlone, City Councilor.
Mark McGovern, Mayor.
Alana Mallon, City Councilor.
Mike Johnston, Cambridge Housing Authority.
Excuse me.
Susan Blazinger, member of the Affordable Housing Trust.
And Ms. Schlesinger, we're going to ask you to say your name again. Someone has asked that we be very cognizant that we speak right into the mic and loudly, although it seems like it's reverberating to us back there, folks can't hear.
Okay, I'll try it one more time.
Thank you.
Susan Schlesinger, member of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund Board.
Peter Daly from Homeowners Rehab and also from the Cambridge Affordable Housing Trust.
Florrie Darwin, member of the Affordable Housing Trust.
Jeff Roberts, Director of Zoning and Development in the Community Development Department.
Iram Farouk, Assistant City Manager for Community Development.
Chris Cotter, Director of Housing, Community Development Department.
Nancy Glowa, City Solicitor.
Quentin Zondervan, Cambridge City Councilor.
Jan Devereaux, Vice Mayor.
Paula Brady, Deputy City Clerk.
Sarah Stillman, Aide to Councilor Siddiqui.
Thank you. To the members of Cambridge Community Development Department, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to take one moment before I turn this over to Jeff Roberts to walk us through the zoning, just to say that we have been, since the last time we met, I know you gave us a charge of putting together the zoning text. It's been quick. I just want to point out that both staff at Law Department and at CDD have spent many hours on putting this together. We sent it out to the committee yesterday. Nobody has seen this language yet, and we are still continuing at the staff level to work on this. So please treat this as a working draft, as a starting point for the discussion, and we really look forward to working with the committee as well as members of the public to refine this over the next few conversations that are scheduled. And because this is relatively new information for folks, we're going to walk you through the zoning, and for that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Roberts.
Thanks, Iram. So rather than go through a dramatic recitation of the zoning text, which I thought about doing for a second, I thought I would just quickly go through touching on each of the different sections of this draft document that we put together, touching on the highlights of each section, and then we're certainly happy to go back and discuss more of the detail. So this is how it lays out. The first couple sections on the purpose, intent, and the applicability, I won't go into that much. We did talk about that quite a bit at the last meeting, and conceptually it's the same as what we discussed back then. The idea being to modify the zoning requirements in all of our zoning districts in order to create less restrictive standards for projects in which all the units are affordable. And there are various goals in that, both to increase the capacity for building these projects and also to promote distribution of those projects throughout the city. So not a whole lot has changed conceptually since the last presentation, but I'll go through some of these other sections and point out some of the areas where there's some new things or some things that have changed. So in section 3 of the document, standards for eligibility, rent, initial sales price, again, as a reminder, all units would be rented or sold to income eligible households, and these would all be permanent, made subject to permanent affordability and conveyed by covenant, similar to, through a similar kind of mechanism then to inclusionary zoning. And in terms of the rental, there's some slight differences in this version in terms of how rental units and home ownership units are being looked at. In terms of rental units, 80% of the units of the project would have to be affordable up to 80% of median income, with the remainder potentially being affordable up to the median income. For home ownership, this was changed a bit so that half of the units would need to be affordable to households up to 80%. The other half could be closer to median income. The idea being that provide more opportunities for home ownership at levels that are closer to median income. And noting just that these are all the upper limits, and depending on the exact funding programs and other criteria associated with the project, there could be variation in terms of the income levels within those limits. And as noted before, because all of these units carry permanent affordability restrictions, typical kinds of market rate housing developments without some kind of a subsidy would not generally be meeting these requirements. So the next section is about use, and this part was very short. It would allow multifamily and townhouse developments as of right for an affordable, entirely affordable project. These are types of development that in some districts under our current zoning would require either a special permit or a variance. Also, consistent with the base zoning and consistent with some of the discussion we've had before, as part of affordable projects, some non-residential use would be allowed at the ground floor. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get further into it. So the development standards are really the main section of this. These standards would modify and supersede other zoning limitations that apply in the district, but in cases where the district is normally less restrictive in terms of its zoning, the less restrictive standards would apply, the goal being not to be more restrictive than the underlying zoning for these projects. And again, as we talked about the last time, these are meant to be form-based standards, and I'll clarify that this isn't necessarily proposing a form-based code. It's an approach that is only for a specific kind of projects, affordable housing projects, but we're regulating it based on height and scale rather than having regulations based on FAR or density of dwelling units. Again, the goal being to be less restrictive in those areas. There was a question, I think the last time, of what exactly we mean by scale. It's a good question. It can mean a lot of different things. In this context, I'm really just using scale as shorthand to refer to the number of stories in the building. So when I say height and scale, we're talking about not just the height in feet, but the number of stories in terms of the building type. And as we discussed before, some of these standards are included to provide additional flexibility and in some cases some incentives to reuse existing buildings. So this piece on height and scale is mainly the same as what we talked about before. For affordable projects, 4-story buildings would be allowed in districts that allow, under current zoning, 40 feet or less. Those are the areas in yellow on this map. And in all the other districts, affordable projects could be 7 stories in height. There were some questions about what happens when you get into these, the areas that are sort of shaded in purple, where the height goes to above 80 feet, and that was something that was left a little bit open-ended the last time. In this version of the zoning text, if in all of these districts, a 7-story building could be built following the affordable housing overlay standards, but for projects going above 80 feet, they would still then be subject to the normal district requirements. So basically the zoning for the dimensional standards for those kinds of projects wouldn't change. They could still be affordable housing projects, of course, but they would be subject to all the other limitations if they were taller than that 7-story height. So the next section is on the sort of what we think of the dimensional standards, the site dimensional standards, yards and open space. This has changed a little bit from the last time. We added a little bit more to the side yard setbacks, and the open space is changed. These standards, when you look at what the setbacks are and the open space requirements, these are generally in line with what's required in the resident C1 zoning districts. The musical accompaniment was nice, but these are, so in a resident C1 district, which is our sort of typical multifamily residential district in neighborhood district in many parts of the city, we apply these sort of 10-foot front, 7.5-foot side, and 20-foot rear yard standards. and a minimum of 30% open space. And we talked a little bit the last time about some of the tension between open space requirements and some other site demands that might apply to a residential project. So we have some provisions to allow some reduction in open space in certain cases, one being as a compensation for providing surface parking where surface parking is needed for the project. And also if there's a situation where a historic building is being preserved, there can, again, be some tension between the goal of trying to preserve the building and meeting the open space requirement. So there's a reduction that's allowed in those cases as well. And there was a question as to whether we would look at more at site studies of these areas. That's something that we're actively working on to try to help illustrate a little bit better how these different kinds of standards play out. For existing buildings, under normal zoning, existing buildings that are pre-existing, non-conforming, can be reused, but there's often situations where buildings need to be altered in a way that would trigger some zoning compliance issues. So that's why there are some provisions added here that will make it easier to convert existing buildings to an affordable housing project. And those include adding floor area within the building, which is sometimes necessary, particularly when a non-residential building is being changed to residential use, as well as some provisions for adding insulation to the building to make it more energy efficient, moving the building as might be required onto different parts of the site, or adding accessibility improvements, which is something that might affect if ramps or other features need to be added. It's something that could affect the open space on the site. Parking is something we talked about the last time and spent quite a bit of time working on. In concept, this section is very similar to what we discussed the last time of setting a baseline ratio of 0.4 space per dwelling unit per affordable dwelling unit. This is based on some survey information that was collected from other affordable housing projects around the city. There would be we look carefully at where there could be some further reductions or waivers of this requirements, and so we looked at areas near transit, and this map is showing a half a mile from rapid transit and a quarter mile from frequent bus routes. We looked at existing buildings and, again, the tension between trying to preserve and convert an existing building and then also needing to add parking, which can be very difficult to do without making significant alterations to the building or site. So we've relaxed the requirement there. For historic buildings, again, as an incentive to encourage historic preservation, we have looked at removing the parking requirements so that additions could be added in a more flexible way without having to, again, completely rebuild the site. And for projects that are small enough that basically we said would require 4 spaces or less, where it could be the case that simply adding a driveway and curb cut might, just in order to provide a few spaces, might actually be detrimental to the overall site design and to the and otherwise might create some issues on the street. We suggested having that be a waiver as well. We've added some other areas of flexibility within the parking regulations, providing opportunity for off-site parking, tandem parking, shared driveways. There are lots of things like this that currently can be accomplished through a special permit, and we're trying to take some of those and make them as of right for affordable housing projects. Bicycle parking would still be provided, but some flexibility in how it's located. We spent some time looking at possible reductions, which we've included for having a blue bike station, a public bicycle sharing station on the site. And one of the provisions that we've looked at as well, this is something that typically happens in projects where there's a reduction in parking by special permit, is that there is a transportation demand management program that involves subsidies for Blue Bikes membership or for transit, so that residents would be able to, would have alternatives, or they could rely less on having to use their cars. So the next section is something we talked about the last time, design standards for buildings. We have in our zoning both some citywide standards for design, as well as different districts have their own sets of standards. So we've tried to collect a lot of what's in other parts of the current zoning ordinance and put together a set of standards that are particularly tailored for affordable housing projects, and these are meant to align with the city's overall urban design objectives of creating pedestrian-friendly building frontages, creating a kind of a neighborhood a scaled feel to the frontage of buildings through transparency, windows, articulation in the facades of buildings. And particularly at the ground floor, making sure that the ground floors are both in terms of how they're designed and where they're situated, are presenting an active face to the street. So for residential buildings, that would mean having some kind of either residential units or some kind of usable community space on the front, and limiting the amount of blank wall or parking that would be right up against the ground floor facade. And in some cases where, it can be difficult to try to foresee the exact situations where a ground floor non-residential active use would be required, but we have tried to work out a way to say that in certain districts, our business districts, which are the ones where we are more typically have more continuous retail use, we would require a active ground floor non-residential space, which could be a range of uses. It could be retail, it could be daycare, or some other use that provides a service to the public, but it could fall into a range of different use categories. So those would be required in areas where there is retail use on the site and retail use on some adjacent site. So again, trying to make sure that there is some maintenance of the continuity of an active ground floor environment.
You could just pause for a moment.
Yes.
I just wanted to let folks know that there's seating on the third floor, and there's overflow seat. There's seating on the third floor in the gallery if people want to sit down, and there's also overflow seating in the Ackerman room where it's being live televised. So no one needs to stand, now as they want to, of course. Please continue.
Thank you. So to continue with the building and site design standards, we have taken some of the standards having to do with mechanical equipment, refuse storage, and loading, which basically deals with where it can be situated on the site and how it needs to be screened, both visually and acoustically. We've taken that entirely from the Article 19 of the zoning ordinance and provided that here. And in terms of environmental design, it's the expectation that these projects would be subject to the same environmental standards that other projects are currently subject to, and those include our green building requirements. We talked the last time about updates to those that are being explored as part of the implementation of the Net Zero Action Plan. Floodplain, there are areas of the city where we have floodplain standards. Those would apply, except that we would not require a special permit. It would just be the actual technical standards that would need to be met. We've included provisions for shielding of lighting and other laws or ordinances that apply, including Department of Public Works regulations would continue to apply to these. There was a question about how this relates to some of the work that we're also doing in the climate change, climate resilience zoning task force, and we don't know at this point because we don't know exactly what those recommendations will be, but I think the expectation is that these projects would be expected to align with whatever the city's environmental standards are going forward. There we go. And then finally, just to wrap up with the section on advisory design consultation. So this is a procedure that is modeled on our current development consultation procedures, which we have in Article 19. They currently apply in some areas of the city that are areas of special planning concern, and we would be applying this to all projects that come under this affordable housing overlay. In this case, the way it's proposed here, it's a little bit more involved than in some of the other areas of the city. It would require one or more community meetings. It would then require a plan submission to the planning board and a public meeting with the opportunity to comment. After the planning board makes its comments about the overall conformance with our development guidelines and urban design objectives, as well as suggesting changes or improvements, it would go back to staff and to the developer to consider those comments, and then would come back to the planning board to present any revisions to the plan. And at that point, the planning board would review. There would be a final report that is submitted to complete the process. Ultimately, this is a non-binding report. It is meant to be an advisory process, and so that makes it different from the special permit process because it would not be a permit that is, they're not issuing a permit that would then be subject to appeal. So that is a summary of the draft, and we're happy to answer any questions.
We're going to hear first from the Affordable Housing Trust, and then I know the mayor has another obligation. He certainly regrets not being able to be here for the entire meeting. We'll have the mayor speak, and then the floor will be open to my colleagues. So from the members of the Affordable Housing Trust, please give your name, and you have the floor.
Peter Daly. First of all, I want to acknowledge and thank the staff for doing an incredible job. You were under incredible pressure to produce a high-quality report in record time, and you did. So I want to thank you and acknowledge all the work that you did in this. A couple of comments I wanted to make about some of the comments I've heard in the past. One is about that all these properties are going to be developed by big developers who are going to get wealthy doing it and line their pockets. And I think it's safe to say that the vast majority of these projects that come out of this are going to be developed by nonprofits with any resources that are generated to go back into the community, are governed by the charitable status of the property. And others were talking about the values that these properties are going to gain on over time. All these will be long-term affordability, governed by the Affordable Housing Trust restrictive covenant that basically eliminates any residual values. These aren't going to be affordable for 5 years or 10 years. They're going to be permanently affordable. So there's no residual value. So there is no huge monetary reward for doing these projects. I wanted to mention a little bit about the whole issue of the sites and the funding, things that we've talked about on our end, about how important that is. And I want to thank the council for referring additional funding to the Finance Committee. That was great news. We very much look forward to seeing how that develops. But as far as the siting side, that's what this overlay does. It provides the opportunity to get an even playing field on sites. And I think it was mentioned at one of the earlier meetings how out of 50 projects that the nonprofits looked at, 47 were lost. And I think it's very safe to say that if we had this in place, more than half of those would have been developed as affordable housing, and there would be a lot of people living in those units right now if we were able to get them. So sites is critical, and if we don't do something like this, I don't know how we're going to get sites. On design review, I know there's some comments that if we don't have mandatory design review, we'll get ugly buildings. And again, speaking for ourselves, but I know the Housing Authority and the other nonprofits take great pride in design review. We look forward to the community process, to going to the planning board, to working with the community development staff. We want to develop the best-looking project that we can for the funds that are available. When we get the advice from the community, we do everything we can to incorporate as much of that as we can into the site. And the big reason why is because it's our reputation. We are all here. We're not going anywhere. We want to stay in Cambridge. We want to thrive in Cambridge. And if we start developing projects that are not well received in the neighborhood, I think it's safe to say that that's probably the end of us working here in Cambridge. Lastly, I just want to say how important this is. I've been really touched by a lot of the public comment of folks who are desperately looking for housing. And I think at this point in our process, we need to do something that is going to give people hope. And right now, there's not a lot of hope. You've heard about how long the wait lists are. And when we tell people how long they're going to have to wait for an apartment, you can just see this look of exasperation in their eyes. We need to do something about that. We need to shorten those waiting lists. And the only way we can do it is by developing more housing. Thank you.
My name is Susan Schlesinger. I'm also from the Trust. I'm not going to go through all the technical stuff related to the petition. You have a letter from the Trust that laid out some of these broad principles related to the overlay proposal. I just want to call your attention to a couple of them. But first I want to talk about need, and I think everybody gets sick of hearing about need, but it is why we're here today. That is, we're losing diversity in Cambridge. Everybody knows that, and you can look at it statistically. This is a proposal that speaks to the lost middle, people between 50 and 80% of median. And you can look at the precipitous drop in the last, 7, 8 years of that population group here. As you can look in the rise of people who make over 120% of median income. Those are trends that other cities see. We're seeing them in a more extreme way, and we have to have an answer to it, and we have to have an answer to it, or a piece of the answer that's going to happen in a reasonable time frame. We're losing people every day. In comments, I hear people say, well, people from outside are going to move into these units. I'm not sure what that means, but the vast number of people who live in Cambridge affordable housing are people from Cambridge who would be outside the community if it were not for that housing. We've always been proud of Cambridge because it is diverse, because we do reach out to people who can't live here and can't pay market costs that are out of control. And we at the Trust believe this is an effective way to site housing across the city, to be able to get multifamily housing in neighborhoods that have zoning that doesn't currently allow multifamily or affordable housing. It's a small subset of projects here. You're talking about 100% affordable housing. And that's not going to be thousands of units. But it will be more units because it will be a much more predictable and efficient process that will not have the 3-year lawsuits, which generally get resolved in favor of the affordable housing, but cost a lot more money and don't create units in any quick manner. So I know that there's been a lot of discussion, and I know there needs to be more discussion, but this affordable housing can't wait. We're losing people. It's not just policy, it really is people. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. I would like to hear from the mayor, because he has to leave, I believe, and then the floor will be open to the committee. I think the judge.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I do apologize for having to leave in a few minutes. Couple questions and then sort of a
And I'm going to have to
comment.
ask you to really
Really
speak loud,
speak into the
because
mic.
people
I'm sorry. I
upstairs,
gotcha.
for whatever reason, the
No,
audio is
I'm
not
usually,
going
it's usually
upstairs.
not a problem for me. But
I know. Don't get
All right.
shy now.
I won't be. Page 7, in terms of height and scale, we've heard concerns. In fact, I just got an email before coming into this meeting that I read that the overlay is going to allow towers and tall buildings to be built in the city. If I read this correctly and I heard you correctly, the overlay itself caps out at 7 stories. Unless there's zoning already in an area that allows more than 7 stories, that zoning applies. But the overlay itself goes up to 7 stories. I don't know if I'm asking that correctly, but.
Sure, through you, Madam Chair. So the provision, the dimensional standards, the modified dimensional standards that apply to affordable housing projects would allow projects of 4 stories in some districts or 7 stories in other districts. You could build an affordable housing project taller if the district allows taller buildings, but a taller building would have to comply with all of the other zoning requirements.
So I'm an affordable housing developer, and this form zoning, we write, the streamlining the permitting process and the as of right, and I want to build an affordable housing building that's 8 stories or 9 stories. I have to comply with the process that's in place outside of the overlay, right? If it's 7 stories or lower, the overlay can apply to me.
Yeah, that's
the mumbling in the back is distracting.
Yeah, that's the intent, yes.
Yes, okay. So I just want to just to make sure when people are concerned that the as of right might lead to 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-story buildings, that is not true. Okay. Second question, and I guess maybe this is, and Ms. Schlesinger, you sort of started to touch on this. Can we, from the folks who build affordable housing, can you explain a little more about why that as of right is important, and what if you don't have that predictability? My understanding is it's difficult to get funding. It makes obviously sometimes can make projects more expensive. So can you just touch on that a little bit more, because I know it's something that really concerns people, but there is a reason for it. It's not in there just as a gift to you. It's imperative to help these projects go forward.
Mr. Daly?
All these projects will depend upon subsidy, not just from the city, but from the state. And there is usually a waiting line for all subsidy these days because of mostly our federal government policies. But even to be able to apply for financing from the state, you need your zoning in place. So if you have to go through a long zoning process, you can't even apply. And if you get appealed, then your application gets put on hold, and you can't apply then until that happens, which is another 3 or 4 years. So that predictability, that able to move quickly, means not only that housing gets developed more quickly, but it also saves all those ancillary costs that you incur during those delays.
Mr. Mayor?
So unlike a larger for-profit developer who has hundreds of millions of dollars behind them and can go back to the bank and get more financing, and maybe can afford a delay and eat that cost, for affordable housing developers, you're talking about killing a project and having it not go forward at all.
Ms. Schlesinger?
Making it much more
loud.
expensive, because during a point of litigation, we have the nonprofit holding, or the housing authority could speak to this as well, holding the property, paying costs, paying lawyers' costs, redesigning the building. They might have lost a good construction cycle. So the costs really add up. And I want to go back to a point Peter made. We build our housing with a lot of leverage. That is, we put in somewhere around $200,000 a unit, and then we get significant dollars from state subsidy sources. So we need to be in every round. We need to have a project keyed up to go, and we just haven't had the sites to be able to do that, and this addresses that. And I do want to emphasize what you said about the height. That is, to build 100%, just on feasibility, I can't think of a project in Cambridge within the last 40 years, 30 years maybe, that was built above 7 stories. So when we looked at the zoning to say, yes, we'll cap it at 7. If something changes and all of a sudden you can financially, feasibly build 10-story projects, fine, we'll go through the regular process. So I think that it really needs to be emphasized what the facts are about rather than the fears in this.
Mayor.
Thank you. And the reason I ask about the financing is because I think there is confusion out there, and from emails that we've received and comments on listservs and things, that people are now bulking together all forms of development. And there is a stark difference between affordable housing development and the way those projects are financed and for-profit luxury unit development and how those projects are financed. So we need to explain that better to people, because that is key to understanding why the as of right is important. And I'm not sure that we're getting that message across. And then I would just say, lastly, I don't want to oversimplify what is a complicated and complex discussion. But as we adjust this plan to try and address concerns, I want us to not lose sight or forget about why are we even doing this at all? And the reason we're doing this is to make affordable housing development more financially viable and possible. So as you nibble around the edges and say, okay, the 5-foot setbacks got people really upset, so now we're going to do 15. Well, maybe they don't like 15. Now we're going to do 30. Oh, well, maybe they don't. Now we're going to do this. Now we're going to. I'm fine with compromising and making this more palpable to people. But at the end of the day, if we kill this by 1,000 cuts, that the projects end up not being financially viable in the end because we have added so many requirements to it, then we might as well not do it at all. So. Yes, let's adjust. Yes, let's try to address the concerns. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is we have to make sure that this makes it financially possible to build more affordable housing. And if it's not going to do that, there's really no point in doing it. So let's not forget that as we think about adjusting and adding more requirements. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. The table is open to my colleagues. Councilor Siddiqui, would you like to lead us off?
Sure. Thank you. So on the point of affordable housing finance, I've talked to some members of the Affordable Trust about this and some of our housing organizations, ABC and CRA. I think it will be important to do some kind of affordable housing finance 101 presentation for the community. I took a crash course in it, and the amount of subsidies involved, it'll make your head turn. And so I think it is important to contextualize that and have us do that at some point in the next few weeks. The other thing is, other questions I have, I think more relate to the implications of a requirement for family size units. I want to kind of tease that out a little bit. Often we hear about families and this need, and I know that the Affordable Housing Trust prioritizes family use units, and I know that it's not required by the overlay, and I think you mentioned something, address it briefly in the Q&A, but, and perhaps the HRI and others who have, or are building affordable housing can speak to this, but what are the pros and cons of the implications, really, of such a requirement, if we were to have one?
Mr. Carter?
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. So we drafted the proposal without putting that requirement in, but knowing that family size units are a significant priority of the city and of the trust. And in the majority of projects that we see coming to the trust, we are, as staff, in the position of working with developers to really help them maximize the number of 2- and 3-bedroom units, particularly given the need that we see, in administering the rental program that we have. It's hardest for folks looking for the largest units to find units. However, we deferred to the overall approach of the overlay to leave in the flexibility without drafting it with a requirement for family size units, so that it would be just that, flexible, so that it could be applied in different cases. One of the ideas, or one of the I think the concerns and ideas that we've heard from folks in the council over the years is the idea of creating smaller units in larger buildings to serve people coming out of homelessness, to serve populations with service needs. So having a family unit requirement in there could make those types of projects a little bit more difficult, particularly if we're looking to apply something uniformly to every project that would be built in the overlay district. But it is certainly the priority, and notwithstanding the fact there's not a requirement there, please rest assured that it would remain the priority to the extent that we would be working with city funds and the priorities of the Affordable Housing Trust.
Thank you. It seems more funds would mean more family-size units. So, okay, thank you for that. And while we're on the topic of money and subsidy, I will say again, it would be helpful when you do the case studies and provide those updates, we get more information on financial implications, because right now, I gotta tell you, the zoning language is helpful, but knowing how much subsidy would be involved from the city, what the state would give in to a specific project, it'd be helpful to have that laid out in the actual case studies that you're presenting. And then finally, and I'll leave, I know my colleagues have technical questions as well. I was surprised to see the bicycle parking be in there, because I've just heard over the years that it's just my anecdotally bring the bike into my house, into my apartment. If there's blue bikes available, I know there's that exemption, but I think if less bike parking could mean one more unit, I'd make that that call. But that's just a comment. I think I was surprised to see that come back, because I thought we were moving away from that. But those are some of my comments. But I look forward to the discussion among my committee members. Thanks.
Pleasure of the committee. Should I call names? Councilor Carlone.
Thank you, Madam Chairs. Madam's Chair. A few questions. I think you've done a good basis for the written word. There's talk of form-based guidance, which I know will come later, but the same sheet, a map on page 7 that the mayor referred to, breaks down really 3 zones: low-scale residential, relatively low-scale residential in yellow, sort of the commercial strips in green, and then the higher density or larger development in purple or bluish purple. And my question is, in green, you have such a variety in heights from 40 to 80, and it seems to me that a property that allows 45 feet is very different in price than a property that allows 65 feet. So why isn't there a gradient? Or I'd ask you to look into more of a gradient. That is, the existing zoning basically says you can build up to a max, let's say it's Mass Avenue between Harvard and Arlington. You can build up to 45 feet as of right, but next to a residential zone, you have to respect the height of that zone within 50 feet. In other words, there's a transition. Well, I don't think we're talking about that here. And a 7-story building in that zone, as I understand it, could be 7 stories, 20 feet away from the property line, next to a 2.5-story house. And I am we're all for maximizing affordable housing, including middle income, even though the demand isn't there, but we've lost our middle income. That's one reason why. There needs to be some sort of a progressive green zone, and or this transition of some sort. And I think this is key to what a lot of worry is focused on is the green zone. I think there was a movie by that name. It sounds familiar. Any thoughts?
Through you, Madam Chair. We have started to work with an architect to model a few different situations, and that's the notion of transitions between the areas of differing heights is one that we have been investigating with them. So far, it has been extremely challenging to find a rule system that works in all of the different contexts, but we absolutely take your comment to heart, and we share that, that goal of trying to refine this so that there can be some kind of height transition, but it needs a little bit more thinking, so we hope to come back with some refinements.
Clearly, if I might continue, Madam Chair, if you had a 100-foot deep site off Mass Avenue, that's one issue where you could incorporate a transition, I believe, easily. But when it's only 50 feet deep or 60 feet deep, and you really want ideally a 60-foot wide building to be efficient, I'm just hoping this goes into the calculation of what sites make sense and what don't. A lot of the purple sites are committed by universities or developed already, except in certain areas that we all know about. Alewife and North Point's not going to change that much since it's permitted. So it seems to me that the larger focus will be on the green zones, and I think that's good in the sense that the services are there, the mass transit is there. So that's positive. It's just this transition, and I think those that are concerned, that is a prime issue. Just have a few other ones thoughts that I wanted to bring up. So the design standards in the zoning, quite frankly, as a consultant for 30 years and a counselor, are very weak, the general guidelines. The urban design objectives are good. They're planning objectives. They're not design objectives, design detail, design review. And this is going to be key, how to develop that in a way, working with the developers of nonprofit buildings. HRI is building a very handsome building on Concord Avenue. That has to be a trustworthy relationship because it's CDD's reputation, it's the city administration, it's the housing trust, it's the developers, and frankly, it's us. A lot of people are concerned about that. So these guidelines really have to be reasonable, but truly informative. And there's some things written in here I won't bring up now that I would question, dimensions but I won't go into that now. That's too much detail. But one thing, since most of these green zones have retail, one-story buildings, to say that a percentage will have retail in the long run, to me is really questionable. We want to strengthen our retail districts, and having more people living there, I think, will help. But to say on page 10 that it would be a percentage, I think the percentages would be night and day, especially given the zoning now specifies between Harvard Square and Arlington and other zones, there has to be active ground floor uses. And how we finance that, I think, will be separate than affordable housing to make it work. Because when it's done by typical development means the rent has to be too high. So I think that's something that has to be working on. And this whole thing about a non-binding design review, I've done design review. I think it was over 50 buildings for the city and other cities. And I can tell you the non-binding ones, if you don't have a good developer and architect, are very unimpressive. And the binding ones are pretty decent, and some are very good. So developing that whole process is really key for the success of this. I think you have to show examples of what you mean in photographs, not just drawings, of examples of what's done. And lastly, I think we all would appreciate getting both documents, the questions of, typical questions asked, which was very informative and useful, and your draft in Word. So we can give you comments earlier rather than waiting to the ordinance committee and just dragging this out even more. And, you know, what we say to you in many cases will be, please explain why this and things like that. It's not, this is completely wrong. So thank you for the effort. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councilor. Councilor Maryland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, I just want to echo my colleagues' comments. I also have significant concerns around not having a sort of middle tier in the green zones, what we're going to be calling the progressive green zones, particularly the BA zone and the BA2, which the BA is Cambridge Street, a small part of Broadway, a small part of Memorial Drive in Cambridgeport, and a small part of the Fresh Pond Parkway. BA2 is just outside of the BC zone in Porter Square and a small section of River Street. To me, I feel like there needs to be a mid-tier, less than the 80 feet, maybe it's 5 or 6 stories, something. I do believe that there is a way we need to be respectful of our neighborhoods and have a step down. So that is something that I really want to echo my colleagues' comments and really challenge you to look at, and I'm glad to hear that you guys are already kind of thinking in that direction. I think that is where where some of the confusion and concern comes from. When we think about this overlays, there's just 45 feet and 80 feet, right? There's nothing in between. And for a lot of our neighborhoods, if I think about Cambridge Street between Inman Square and the end of Cambridge Street, it's all, 2 and 3 story buildings. And we're gonna say those are gonna be, 7 stories at 80 feet all of a sudden. And I know that there aren't gonna be ones popping up all at the same time, but there needs to be some kind of consideration for those progressive green zones. So thank you for giving it a name, Councilor Carlone. I think one of the concerns I've been hearing a lot about is tear downs here in Cambridge and the proliferation of tear downs for buildings. And so I have a few questions about that, because it doesn't, if I'm looking at the zoning language, in 5.3, it says, existing structures can be altered, reconstructed, extended, and/or enlarged for an affordable housing overlay project as of right. It doesn't specifically say whether a structure can be torn down, and so I'm wondering if that's something that we could explicitly say, or if it's omitted for some reason. So that's one question. And if there is going to be a tear down, is there a demolition delay ordinance that is going to be still in effect with the historic? And if you could speak to that, both of those things around tear downs.
Through you, Madam Chair. Yes, so the section that you read, Councillor Mellon, deliberately leaves that opening, that there will be certain instances where it doesn't make sense for a building to be preserved, and it would need to be demolished, either because it's in really bad shape, or could be a host, or it could just be a building of no significant value. Sometimes that happens as well. But absolutely, zoning does not in any way trump historical regulations, which are a different category altogether. So demolition delay would still be in effect. This in no way precludes that. So for historic buildings, that would be in effect.
Okay, so that gets me to my sort of second question, which is what supersedes what when we're talking about this affordable housing zoning overlay in terms of conservation districts, historic districts, overlays that already are in place, like the Central Square overlay or the, any of the Alewife overlays. What supersedes what?
Sure. So when an overlay is in zoning, all of those lay on top of each other and all would or could apply depending on what the specific question is. In this case, it's envisioned that this overlay would trump all the others for 100% affordable development. However, we're only talking about things that are in zoning. If there is something that is a historical regulation or a additional city ordinance, that would in no way be it's not intended to be impacted by this. I will defer, though, to the city solicitor if she wants to say something, if I misspoke, or if you want to correct that.
I just want to remind people to keep their voices up. Are you hearing all right up there? Okay, they want you to holler, please. Not at each other, but into the mic.
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. Yes,
Speak up, Ms. Glowa. I know it's not your style,
Sorry.
but do your best.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Other laws, whether they are local laws or state or federal laws, would still apply. So this is only zoning. So the Historic Commission's jurisdiction still applies in whatever ways it does now, and that would have to be taken into account for any project under this overlay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So through you, the way I'm understanding that is because it's state enabling legislation for some of these districts, these conservation districts and historical districts, those are superseding this overlay in terms of what can be done.
Through you, Madam Chair, not precisely. So we have certain historic requirements that derive from state law, but we have other historic provisions that are based upon our own historic ordinance. And their Conservation Commission regulations apply pursuant to state law. So it depends on which laws. But I guess the easiest way to think about it is that zoning regulates zoning issues, but it doesn't trump other types of laws that may apply to any particular property.
Okay, thank you. I think it would be very helpful to somehow write that up, because we do get asked that question a lot. It would be great to have some kind of information to send out to people who are concerned about that issue. My last question is, when I'm going through the zoning, I'm reading about affordable housing overlay projects. Who gets to decide what is an overlay project? So is there a certification process by CDD? So can I, just as a playing devil's advocate, can I just decide that my house is an affordable housing project because it is affordable to me, it is a single-family dwelling, and that is written in this zoning, and if I'm not paying more than 30% of my income in my housing costs, can my house be considered if I just want to put an addition on my house without going to the BZA or the planning board? So my question is, what in this zoning prevents me and others from doing that?
Through you, Madam Chair. So the idea behind what is an affordable housing project that would be subject to these provisions would be a deed restriction that guaranteed permanent affordability of any building that was developed or under these provisions with marketing and selection plans that are approved by the city that would be open and allow for fair access to that housing. So if someone wanted to do something like that, we could look at that, though I think it would be unlikely that we would see small buildings like that come in that way. But certainly, as we said, in other contexts, we're open to a variety of ways to create new affordable units. Certainly looking within the existing stock is something that we would do as well.
Okay, thank you. I have a lot of granular details as well. As Councilor Calderon said, it would be wonderful to have some kind of document so we can all make our comments and submit them to you, so we don't have to torture you with them right now. So thank you for thank you for answering my questions.
Thank you, Councilor. Pleasure of the committee. Councilor Zondervan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And through you, I too have a lot of questions. I won't ask them all tonight. And I want to preface my statements by echoing my colleagues and saying that we're all in favorable of affordable housing. And so when I ask questions, and some of them may be quite challenging questions, it's so that I can fully understand what the implications are of this policy, because if we are going to do this, it should actually have the intended effect of improving our affordable housing situation. So I want to ask a little bit of the Affordable Housing Trust representatives, because you made some statements that I just want to clarify what you said. So you said that there were a lot of projects that would have gone through if we had this affordable housing overlay in place. But again, I just want to clarify and make sure I understand it correctly, because my understanding is that the number of projects that we actually are able, the number of units that we're able to build are funding limited. So even if all of those projects could have gone through, they wouldn't have, because we wouldn't have enough money to build all of them at one time.
Counselor, can you keep your voice up?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
I think one of the commitments we've always gotten from the city manager and the city staff is that if we need more resources, let's go to the city council and make that case. So I think where the limitations are have been somewhat by money, but also by the fact that we just don't have the projects to pursue. And I think that if the trust was completely out of funds and we needed more, and I think we've even seen that, for instance.
We're trying to help you be louder.
Okay. With the projects like Fresh Pond, I mean, I think we've all made an absolute commitment to make Fresh Pond apartments affordable in perpetuity. And if the trust does not have enough money to do that, I've heard from the city council that come to us, talk to us, and we'll see what we can do to make it work.
Councilor Zondervan.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and through you, and that's absolutely true. And in fact, we did recently negotiate with the city manager some additional spending that would go into this. But again, I'm just trying to understand how many actual units would we be able to develop. And I understand that having sites available obviously makes a difference, but it makes a difference in terms of how easy it is to do these projects. But it's my understanding that it wouldn't increase the number of units that we'd be able to build, because that is dependent on the amount of funding we have available.
Yes, but I think our funding is going to go further under this. Just to give you an example, if we were bidding on a site with a private developer that would allow 10 units, and the asking price per unit was $200,000 a unit, if we were able to double the density on that, all of a sudden that acquisition price comes significantly down. And that makes our project more competitive for other funding sources. It means our TDC will be lower, and therefore we'll be able to stretch those important subsidy dollars even further.
Council?
Thank you. So assuming that we have the same amount of funding that we do now, and again, that's going to increase, but assuming that it's static for now, how many units of affordable housing are we able to build currently and then per year, and how many would we be able to build under the overlay? I understand that there's no exact answer, but just sort of your estimates.
Through you, Madam Chair, we have seen trust funds used to produce roughly 60 units a year over the last few years, and that, I think, is our best estimate at this point, given the funding that we have. If funding goes up, certainly that number could go up. The other thing to consider is that, as Peter noted, we have had a strong commitment to preserving expiring use housing over the last 8 to 10 years. We have one very large property to deal with in the short term, and after that, it will be easier for us to look at the resources and put more of the funding that the trust has into new production. So I think that 60 or so unit a number, 60 so units a year number would carry forward. It is consistent with what our projections are based upon funding. Again, obviously, if funding goes up, that may change. And then the goals that we're setting with Envision would account for roughly 1,000 units over the next 12 years. So a little bit higher, but again, if there are additional funds that could be attainable. But again, the biggest challenge that we've seen, even over the last 2 to 3 years, while we have not been entirely focused on new production as we've been dealing with preservation, the biggest challenges have been finding sites to invest and to bring through the development process cycle and to then get in line for the state funds. We mentioned I think Susan mentioned the state funding round, and our goal is to have a project in that round every year. So we have a fairly sizable project getting funding every year. There's a round happening now. There's no project from Cambridge in there. We don't have a site that's ready for that funding cycle.
Counselor?
Great, thank you. So through you, Madam Chair, I'll ask some other questions more specific to the zoning next. I want to look at the purple, so-called purple zones, where the height limits are much higher. And earlier, the mayor asked about the fact that the buildings would have to comply with the existing processes, but am I correct in understanding that they would be able to build as of right? So they would have to meet all the other requirements, but they would still be able to build as of right, whereas for-profit developers may require a special permit to build those larger buildings. Is that true or not?
Through you, Madam Chair. So, it's this is where I'll go back to pointing out that this is a sort of a draft for discussion. I think that's a topic that could continue to be discussed if the committee wanted to go one way or the other. I think there are different ways to look at it. I think the intent was, as we described it and as was described in the comments before, that the expectation is projects that are being built under this overlay would pretty much max out at 7 stories, but we didn't want to be more restrictive than current zoning. So it could be, that was the general intent, but if you wanted to get into specifics, you could ask, well, could they comply with all the dimensional requirements? If they were bigger than 50,000 square feet, the normal zoning might require a project review special permit from the planning board. The overlay could be looked at as something that continues to require the project review special permit or not. And if it did require a project review special permit, then as with any special permit, it could proceed through the comprehensive permit process under 40B. So, that could be just sort of an open discussion if the council or the committee had opinions about where it should go.
Great, thank you. So I would like to see that clarified. So I guess we'll continue that discussion and decide one way or the other how we want to proceed on that. On the parking requirements, so it's my preference that we completely eliminate parking requirements. And just for the audience to be clear, that doesn't mean there won't be any parking at those projects. It just means that the developers would decide what was appropriate parking for that particular project. Based on the numbers you put here, it seems like basically projects of 10 units or less wouldn't have a parking requirement based on the current language. But what's the thought of having a parking requirement at all? Why not simply say there's no parking required and then let the developers decide what makes the most sense for that particular project?
I'm happy to just extrapolate on parking. It's an issue that always generates a lot of interesting discussion. I think that's certainly a choice. I mean, parking, as it relates to zoning, has a lot of different dimensions to it, and the way that parking has been thought about over the years in the planning field has certainly changed a lot, and it's definitely the case that there is more of is evolving thinking about whether it's appropriate to require parking as a function of zoning, or to look at it as was described, as something that the market will drive, or, you know, the need will drive the provision of parking, and then it will, and then it'll play out that way, and it doesn't need to be a minimum requirement in zoning. And then, of course, and we have applied in other places, looking at maximum requirements for zoning and for parking within zoning because of the trying to manage traffic impacts. But there are a lot of other considerations to take into account. There's the availability and supply of on-street parking, and impacts on public resources. That's a consideration that factors in. Exactly how you balance that among various other factors is complicated. I would just say that the draft as it's written now is based on what I would describe as a balanced approach to saying what's a ratio that makes sense given the information we have now about affordable housing projects. Where and under what circumstances do we think additional flexibility is warranted? And we know that in areas that are proximate to rapid transit, there is a demonstrable reduction in the demand for parking spaces, and that is something that could be employed. And also, just as probably the biggest complication with dealing with parking and zoning is it has a lot of impacts on other goals and objectives that are in zoning, in terms of getting the right urban design, the right type of scale of buildings, the appropriate amount of landscaping and site design. Fitting parking spaces on a site is not a particularly easy task, and it can be costly as well. So that is where we've landed where we've landed in an attempt to put together a reasoned set of standards, and to cover a range, and to sort of suggest a few different areas where there is a rationale for providing additional flexibility. And again, in terms of the tension with other objectives, using further reductions in parking is a way to incentivize other objectives like historic preservation or increased open space. And it'll ultimately have to be, again, a decision that the council would make along with our support as to where to balance all those different objectives.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense to me. I will say that, if I look at this map, it's pretty much, 80 or 90% of where these projects would actually likely happen, the parking requirements would be waived. And so again, I lean towards saying, let's just not have the requirement at all, rather than having it be this complicated. But, I do appreciate the movement in that direction.
If I could just say one last thing related to that, which is that what we have put forward is based to a great extent on utilization information that we got from some of the nonprofits in existing projects. But obviously they are in different locations, and certainly the nature of how people get around is constantly evolving as well. So we are continuing to have conversations with both our transportation staff at CDD as well as with the traffic and parking department staff. But we would certainly take the council's guidance on if you think that is one of the things that is worth supporting, because clearly when we talk to the providers, the cost of parking is one of the most significant elements that could help a project be more financially viable.
Thank you. I certainly take that into account, and I also see it as an opportunity to see what happens if we remove parking requirements in exchange for higher density. In terms of the retail, there's not a lot of mention in the text of existing retail, and I would really like to see us use the zoning as a way to protect existing retail so that we can start to unlock opportunities where there is retail, where it makes a lot of sense to put housing on top of that retail, but we want to retain the existing vendor. We don't want to displace our retail vendors and tenants in order to add housing. So I would like to explore ways that we can capture that in the zoning so that, for example, there's a provision that allows the existing retail tenant to return at an affordable rent, because we can provide affordable rents to businesses as well as to individuals. And then my last question is around the environmental design standards, and particularly our net zero action plan, which, if I'm understanding it correctly, we will begin to require net zero construction for small residential in 2022 and larger residential projects in 2025. So again, this feels to me like an opportunity to pull some of that forward and say, what if we made these affordable housing projects under the overlay net zero right away? And I spoke with an architect who's done several projects already in Cambridge that are affordable housing projects where there's no on-site combustion, for example. It does not necessarily mean that there's additional cost. In fact, it can be a cost saving in some cases, and it certainly represents a cost savings to the tenants over the long term because their utility bills would be lower. So again, I would like us to consider that possibility that we could start to implement some of our requirements for net zero as part of this overlay, because it's coming up pretty quick anyway, and we are already gaining a lot of experience in the marketplace that's telling us that the costs are not, in fact, greater in all cases. And so, we need to have some flexibility in there to make sure that we're not requiring anything that's not feasible. But as long as we feel comfortable with that, I would like us to consider that.
So, through you, Madam Chair, the approach that we took, given that the spirit of the overlay is to make things easier, so our approach was to not create requirements that don't exist for all other similar development. So while we have said that the environmental standards would not be relaxed for affordable housing projects under the overlay, we have tried to steer clear of creating requirements that are over and above what all other residential projects would have to, would be mandated to do. That being said, affordable housing projects right now in the city are, I would say, like the shining stars in terms of sustainability, and HRI especially has done some extremely efficient development in the city. And I don't know, Peter, if you might want to add more to this. So that's really the concern that we, or the balance, I guess, for the council to, in the effort to make it better, to not impose an additional requirement that might pose a burden. So, but we're happy to continue to have that conversation and get a better understanding from the developers if there's something that might make sense.
Mr. Daly?
Yes, Madam Chair. I think this is something that most nonprofits really believe strongly in, but it does come down sometimes to money. And I think, again, having the restriction in there will push up the cost of the project. And if that cost can be identified somewhere. Right now, there are significant sources out there that are willing to fund things like that, and we're benefiting from that. I don't know how long that's going to stay into the future.
I think similarly on the retail points that you were raising, that without a source of money to ensure affordable rent for a business, which is a subsidy to a business, it will decrease the number of units because it'll raise the cost of the project. So that's, unless we have an answer to that, and that's every year it's rent control for commercial property in some respects. So I'm not aware of any state or federal program that we could access for that. And I think the cost would be significant if they were to be subsidized by the city.
Thank you.
Thank you. And
Counselor?
just to clarify, the rents would be similar to what they are now. So really, what I'm asking for is a way to protect their rents rather than the rents going up. So I'm not thinking of a subsidy, I'm just thinking about a guarantee that the rent wouldn't rise more than is needed in order to cover the costs. And in terms of the environmental requirements, again, since the city is planning to require that of everyone, and since it's in our interest to make sure that these requirements are implemented, certainly it would seem reasonable for us to pay for that if there is an additional cost, again, as long as it's reasonable, so that we're not doubling the cost or something like that. We're just talking about, in some cases, perhaps a slight increment, and again, we'd want to capture what's a reasonable requirement, not anything unreasonable, of course. And thank you for the text and particularly the frequently asked questions, which are very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Zondervan. Madam Vice Mayor?
Thank you. I appreciate all of this too, although I'm a little overwhelmed with the amount of information and the complexity of zoning. And I want to remind us that this is the Housing Committee and not the Ordinance Committee. So it feels like we've gone straight from a highly conceptual thing to a very detailed, and I realize it's still in a rough draft form, zoning proposal. So while I appreciate that the PowerPoint tried to give us the sort of high level vision, the actual zoning language, we really do need to go through it and have it explained line by line. Speaking for myself, I see a lot of potential for the goals, there being some wiggle room where there is language that is may and not must, or, it's in the category of it would be great to have this, but if we need to do this, then all bets are off, and that goes to the non-binding review. I interpreted the language around the planning board as having a meeting under general business, which I think typically doesn't include public comment, and it says that written comment can be submitted. So it's not clear to me how the public input is really considered, and I think that goes to a lot of the concern that residents are feeling about this being a very, it injects a tremendous amount of uncertainty for every property owner in the city. And I think it would really be helpful if we want this to succeed for us to be very clear on the types of sites that would actually be desirable for affordable housing developers to have an opportunity to develop. And that goes to the size of the parcel, the number of units that are sort of the sweet spot. I've heard people say that, between 20 and 40 units is kind of the ideal. You don't want to be doing 8 or 10 unit ones. So, I think it would be really helpful to sort of know what the sites are so that we can appropriately really hone in on what the zoning and design standards for those are. I agree with many of the comments and questions that my colleagues asked, particularly about these transitional ones, family-sized units. I like Councilor Siddiqui's suggestion of an affordable housing financing 101 for us and for members of the public. I agree with Councilor Carlone that photos and examples, I think also when it gets down to community meetings, I think 3D models are helpful. It's still, renderings are very subjective, and it's easy to make a rendering look really appealing. And I think a 3D model, particularly when we're talking about significantly relaxing dimensional standards, really brings home what we're talking about. I have the same concerns that Councilor Mellon has about the proliferation of tear downs and the impact on conservation districts, and I'm still not quite understanding how those things work together, the overlay and the various conservation districts. A couple of times in the zoning language, there's a reference to the State Register of Historic Places. I'm not familiar with, I know the National Register of Historic Places. I'm not familiar with what properties in Cambridge are on the state register or how that plays into it. And I think I'm most concerned about open space and the attitude toward open space. I realize that this seems to acknowledge people's prior stated concerns about reductions in open space by bumping it back to 30%, but then if you read the zoning language carefully, you see that all of that open space can be consumed with parking, bike parking, paved surfaces, balconies, so that none of it really becomes what the average person would consider open space, and it deprives the residents of those units of essentially outdoor space that is usable for their own. It's to me it seems very limiting. I see one. I think tree was used once in the zoning as one of the things in addition to hardscape that someone could put in their open space. So while the city is doing a tremendous amount of work to try to figure out how to preserve and restore and increase our tree canopy, this zoning essentially ignores the fact that trees exist and that people of all income levels benefit from having green space and open space available to them. Looking at the photo, the image on page 11, which is a picture of a 10-unit building, affordable project, which is being used as an example. I'm curious to know if that building were built on that site today, how many units would it have with an overlay? Would it be 20 units? Could it be 20 units? What more would one want on that site? How would the design change? That would be instructive for me to know, just to understand what impact this overlay has, not only on neighborhoods, but on projects, affordable projects that have already been built. I, too, share a lot of concerns about how we're going to preserve local retail, particularly in the neighborhood business districts. Again, the overview says that there are incentives, but in fact it seems to me to be reduced to one small space that could be an active use, but it might not be actual retail. It might be an architect's office or something, and I think that's not what people want to see in their business districts, and it wouldn't be useful to the residents of the building in particular. So I think, I'm sorry if this sounds negative, but the reality is, if this is going to be successful, we need to actually discuss how the zoning language works and what impact it has and how we can make it work to accomplish the goals that we all share, which is to open up more sites to the development of housing that is, contextually appropriate. And I certainly understand that, HRI and Just a Start have their reputations on the line, but in my opinion, it's a sort of trust but verify, and by leaving it so flexible and giving the planning board and residents really no binding say, you're asking an awful lot, and I think that's creating an awful lot of anxiety in the community. I want to acknowledge that, because I don't think it's fair not to address that, that it is unnecessarily asking every resident in the city, every property owner, to take an enormous leap of faith that it'll all work out fine, don't worry. And that, this zoning is a legal document, so I want to make sure that all the I's are dotted and all the T's are crossed. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Please be reminded, for those that are tuning in or those that are present, at the next meeting on this topic, which is April 9th. It's a roundtable. And at roundtables, there's no public comment, but following that meeting, April 16th, there will be another meeting, and that's public comment only, to just talk about hearing from the public, an opportunity for you to weigh in, similar to how we did it a week or so back, after which there's another meeting on the Housing Committee on the 25th. At this juncture, we will now open the floor to public comment. Each person can speak for up to 2 minutes. Please come to the microphone that's provided there. If your comments are written, please leave a copy. If they're not, our deputy clerk will leave her card so that you can send us a copy of your remarks. If they're given to us by 12 midnight, they will be provided and made part of the record. Having said that, I turn the floor over to Councilor Siddiqui.
And please state your name and address. And I think this part makes it seem that I'm a really mean person. I love everyone. I'm just gotta keep it moving. Yeah. So first up is Elizabeth Gorbozy, 42 Irving Street. 42
That's
Irving?
not you?
Okay, sorry, I read it wrong. Could you please turn the mic on?
There we go. Yes, I'm Elizabeth Hodeling, and I wanted to thank the counselors for asking such insightful and granular questions tonight, because I think that you posed a lot of the questions that we residents have. I've lived in Cambridge for 40 years, and I would like to be on the side of the angels in this one, but there's simply too many questions. And I feel as though the overlay as written is simply a blunt instrument, even if it's trying to do a very good thing. I'm a former government bureaucrat, and I have to say I'm not comfortable with the idea that neighborhood groups are going to be silenced going forward with this overlay, and that these decisions are going to be left to people who are, I'm sure, very well educated and very well meaning, but really the neighborhoods will be silenced under this. So I appreciate all the questions that you're raising, and I look forward to the next meeting. Thank you.
Fritz Donovan is up next, followed by Dipendra, followed by John Pitkin.
Starting now. Fritz Donovan, 42 Irving Street. Cambridge has a lot of smart people. Cambridge city government has a lot of smart people. And I would bet 99% of us are in favor of affordable housing. So why are so many people at each other's throats? That's easy. The city spent 3 years and $3 million working on a plan whose stated objectives were to enhance housing, mobility, climate and environment, urban forms, economy, and community well-being. But all we ended up with is the 100% affordable housing overlay proposal before you tonight. A large number of people have been told that is enough. Please come, speak in favor, and help us slam this through. And tell anybody who objects to the details that they are, shall we say, insensitive to the needs of the poor. But another large number of people have looked at the details, and they are aghast at how unbalanced this plan is. There is, for instance, no mention of mobility. The recommended drastic cutbacks in open space requirements would deal a major blow to our climate and environmental needs. Urban form would only comply with broad, just announced form-based rules. The planning board's role would be reduced to non-binding advisory status. Economy would involve a recommended $20 million a year from the city tax revenues intended to help nonprofit developers compete with market-based developers. But some economists say adding the city as a new bidder would only drive land prices up even higher. And the current level of hostility has community well-being at about the lowest ebb I have seen since I moved to this wonderful city 63 years ago. Cambridge deserves better. I admire the eagerness of all the label-wearing supporters pushing affordable housing. On that goal, we are all in the same boat. But they should admire those of us putting in the extra effort to make
Fritz, could you please leave your comments?
Make sure we get this right.
Dipendra, followed by John Pitkin, followed by Young Kim, followed by John Kennedy, followed by James Zoll. Oh, And please leave your written comments if you can, or email them.
My name is John Kennedy. I live at 25 Avon Street, and I'm,
Please speak in the mic.
yes, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Can you hear me? Okay, John Kennedy, 25 Avon Street. I think that the big thing is I agree with a lot of the things that Mr. Donovan just talked about, and also some of the serious questions by city councilors have raised tonight. There are already like 62 different zoning districts in this city, and there are also innumerable number of historical districts. The whole concept of adding another layer to this unmanageable situation, it makes no sense at all to me. So I think that's what people have to keep in mind. There's only so much energy that we all have, and the focusing on another overlay district to this zoning is, to me, is madness. We really need to focus on figuring out a better way to do the zoning here within the requirements we have. Thank you.
Thank you. Is James Zoll there? Or Stephanie Cox? Fred Meyer? Someone's coming up. Oh, everyone's here. Great. I said, is James Zoll, then Stephanie, then Fred.
I'm James Zoll, 203 Pemberton Street. It's nice to hear that everybody is now in favor of more affordable housing. That contradicts the evidence of my ears and the evidence that I've been hearing for the last 3 years as this proposal has been discussed at many meetings. If we are in favor of affordable housing, I would ask that people keep in mind that this is a zoning proposal intended to increase in a pretty modest way the number of affordable units in our city. If we also ask it to grow more trees, to reduce traffic, to cure cancer, and do a number of other things, then I don't think we will have an ordinance, and reduce rents for small businesses. I don't think we're going to wind up with an ordinance at all, least of all one that does what we're asking this one to do. Thank you.
And Stephanie, I'm sorry, I saw Young Kim, who didn't hear me before, so please say your comments.
Good evening. My name is Young Kim. I'm at 17 Norris Street. I sent the email to all you councilmen and to the CDD asking for documents to be deposited into into some place where we can get to it. And today I found it, and I really appreciate having it posted. But the material should be posted in advance so that we can form informed opinion before we have the meeting. Second thing is that I understand that we need affordable housing, just like I understood the need for rent control. But the way I understand it is the nonprofit organization cannot bid in open market with the deep-pocketed developers. So I understand that we need to give nonprofit organization some help. But then why are we extending the same advantage to the deep-pocketed developers? We have been burnt over and over again by developers. I'm sure I know that there are a lot of good developers, but on the other hand, there are a lot of developers who have deep pockets who care only for big dollar sign. So if it's open, is open to all developers, then they will find some way of getting around to it. And when I first got involved with neighborhood issues like this, the key phrase that kept coming up, and I think the whole purpose behind the zoning ordinance is to preserve.
Thank you, Mr. Kim. We have your comments. If you have these comments, we'll take them. Stephanie, followed by Fred Meyer, followed by Charles Franklin.
Good afternoon, Stephanie Cox, 73 Dana Street. I work in affordable housing in other parts of the state, and a lot of the arguments that I've heard here are very familiar. And I would just encourage the council and in all of your hard work in the committee to not let perfection be the enemy of the good. There are so many changes that are already happening in our community, and if we look for the perfect proposal, Rome is burning, and people are moving out on a monthly basis of this community. We'll never have a perfect proposal that everyone will be okay with, so we have to come up with something that we think is going to reach the total good. So I would just encourage you to listen to the concerns, but as the mayor said, not have this proposal be killed by a death of 1,000 cuts. I think that, some of the concerns that have been raised about property values, property values here have been skyrocketing for a long period of time. I don't think anybody is in danger of going down just because somebody builds a building that's 1 story higher than what they previously had there. So I think that we need to tamp down some of the rhetoric here and recognize that change is always going to happen in our community, but we have a decision of what type of community we want to have in terms of whether or not it's inclusive. And, we also have a question of whether or not abutters' rights outweigh the rights of people who grew up in this community to be able to continue to live here. So I think that's something for us to consider on a broader scale. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer, followed by Charles Franklin, followed by T. Grace, followed by Marilee Meyer.
Fred Meyer, 83 Hammond Street. I completely agree with the previous speaker that helping people who already live in Cambridge stay here should be our chief goal. When I moved here 60 years ago, Cambridge was an old factory town in serious decline. People were moving away in droves, preferring to commute to their good jobs in Boston from shiny new suburbs. But highways quickly became crowded, people tired of commuting. Biotech came to Kendall Square, resulting in a rent boom, making both Cambridge buildings and rents sky high. These new high values of real estate have empowered ever lower real estate taxes here every year. But sadly, I think we've spent far too little of that money to help our longtime tenants who don't work in biotech stay here. Let's stop this civic neglect and raise our taxes, not lower them. None of my neighbors support this out-of-scale citywide zoning idea, but every neighbor I've asked is quite willing to pay more taxes to help less fortunate folk who are not lucky enough to buy their own house here years ago, as most of us did. Let's have rent subsidies. Let's pay our city workers more. We don't really need zoning overlays, do we? Instead, let's stop lowering our taxes every year. That's morally indefensible. Start investing more city tax money to help our unluckiest tenants in simple, direct, careful ways. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take your comments. Charles Franklin, followed by T. Grace, followed by Marilee Meyer, followed by Natalie Ribeiro.
Charles Franklin, 162 Hampshire Street. At the last meeting, I expressed my fears that the overlay as written would increase inequity in the city. Having reviewed the newly published wording, my views have not changed. The plan has adopted a 30% open space requirement, something I've advocated for, but then proceeds to undo it with exceptions. It can be reduced to 15% for hardscape parking that can be further reduced by covered bicycle parking. If you can't see the sun, it's not open space. I could go on about why I don't like this plan, but instead I'm going to talk about ways to address my issues with it. I have my own plan which takes greater care to give bonuses to affordable housing while respecting the surrounding neighborhoods. It collapses the ludicrous 50 existing zones into 8 affordable zones, as opposed to the 2 the city has proposed. In each zone, there are different setbacks and different building heights and sizes, each of which are increased respective of the existing zones there. I would really like to see this plan discussed at the next round table. I don't know if that's possible, but I think there's a lot of good work here, and I think it's worth discussion. But regardless of what happens, this zone, that zone, this plan, any kind of as-of-right bonuses to affordable developers should require a certification from the city. And in order for a developer to get this certification, their existing buildings should be inspected and made sure that their current units are kept up to health and safety standards. And no developer should be given any kind of special permissions to build as of right unless their existing units are habitable. Thank you.
T. Grace, followed by Marilyn Meyer, followed by Natalie, followed by Eugenia, followed by Stephen Kaiser. Said that really fast. T. Grace, Marilyn Meyer, Natalie. Oh, great.
My name is T. Grace Atkinson. I live at 35 Harding Street in Cambridge. I was at the meeting on the 8th, and I live streamed it last week. I'm really kind of confused because I hear all this about externalities, and I haven't read anything or heard anything about the internal parts of these units. I've looked at a couple of inclusionary units, and I really was scared because they're micro units. And they have Juliet balconies, which may be convenient to jump off of, but you can't, they're not livable if you don't have space to breathe. So when I hear overlays and flexibility, I think, uh-oh, what does that mean? You're going to squeeze more units into a smaller space, and before you know it, we're going to have micro apartments. So I just beg you, think of the people who are living inside these spaces. And 400 square feet is supposed to be the minimum of a humane space. And please don't forget that. Somebody asked me, are you for affordable housing? Well, that's like saying, are you for mom and apple pie? Everybody's for affordable housing. It's the details. And remember, it has to be livable. I have a list of articles on the health hazards of these micro units. For the elderly, for the young, they do a lot of psychological and neurological damage. You have to follow these studies. They shouldn't be building these in Cambridge.
Thank you for your comments. If you have them, please leave them. Marilyn Meyer, followed by Natalie Rivera, followed by Eugenia, followed by Stephen Kaiser.
Hello, Marilyn Meyer, 10 Dana Street, and I thank you for all your input. A lot of my questions were discussed by the counselors, et cetera. The idea of the overlay, just having, two dimensions, 45 feet and 80 feet, that sounds fairly reasonable. The problem is with the form-based code that was only introduced March 5th. You can be as wide as you want on the lot, and in some cases that can be up to 6 and 10 times the density based on width and depth, and it doesn't have to take in the height at all. So I'm for keeping the FAR. But with the form-based code, technically the form-based code is to be implemented neighborhood by neighborhood according to their literature, tailoring requirements to fit specific places, not here. we've reduced everything to 2 zones instead of looking at each of the neighborhoods. And what I see is well, not all neighborhoods are economically feasible, and not all have public transportation prerequisites for housing. And we lose. CDD wants to impose a theoretical urban form on an old city with historical preconditions without community or planning board approval as of right. And there are no infrastructure or financial studies or trees get in the way. I want to know what happened to all the policy orders.
Thank you. We'll take your written comments.
Okay.
Thank you. Natalie?
Hi, my name is Natalie Ribeiro. I'm the Housing Advocacy Director at CEOC at 11 Inman Street. I'm submitting 123 petitions today in support of the affordable housing zoning overlay signed by Cambridge residents and Cambridge employees. The zoning petition will allow for 100% affordable housing. People who fall below median income would live there. Participants from CEOC who have attended these meetings with me and would benefit from this proposed housing are seniors on fixed incomes, administrative assistants, healthcare workers, school teachers, human service workers, food industry, retail, security, and nonprofit employees, just to name a few. Please stop thinking that people who fall below median income all need to live by the red line. It's just not true. Affordable housing units are already found in Cambridge far beyond the red line, and they are filled and waitlisted too. Cambridge's Housing Authority at Corcoran Park is a great example. It's right on the Belmont-Cambridge line. People who fall below median income get around just like everyone else, and there won't be a food desert either. I respect concern over the size and style of proposed buildings, but there will be time for community input. I think there are already wonderful and numerous examples of affordable housing that totally blend in with the surroundings. Again, Cambridge Housing Authority's Garfield Street is a good one, or 15 Inman Street next to CEOC. We urge you to support the overlay. Thank you.
Eugenia, followed by Stephen Kaiser, followed by Carol O'Hare.
Hi, I'm Eugenia Schry. I live at 259 Washington in the Port. Last hearing, I began with a prediction that has already come true, that this proposal will make Cambridge the leader it should be on the essential equity issue of affordable housing. And I predicted that there'd be coverage of this. And then the Globe called us ground zero on affordable housing for even contemplating this proposal. So let's pass this proposal and be the affordable housing leader that Cambridge should be. Cambridge should be that. Since it's another hearing, let me make another prediction. Some critics have complained about the lack of open space in this more dense housing, meaning lack of backyards, and that it's going to put the kids who get to live there at a disadvantage. As someone who grew up in New York City, I didn't have a backyard, and none of my friends did either. And none of us felt deprived at all. In fact, we felt obnoxious and superior to our suburban friends. So I predict the kids who get to live in these dense city-like units aren't going to feel deprived, but are going to feel lucky to have access to the great opportunities that this city offers, like great schools, a world-class museum that's free to Cambridge residents, cool opportunities, and getting to take their yearbook photo shoots in Graffiti Alley. Thank you so much.
Stephen Kaiser, followed by Carol O'Hare, followed by Peter from Inman Street.
Yes, for several weeks I've been asking for that the Envision report, the plan, the final plan, be released and made available. And I was also urging that the draft zoning be released. Well, last night we had a breakthrough. I got copies of the draft zoning. So we're halfway there. We still need the planning report. But I went into the draft zoning and I was looking from the very beginning for definitions. I could find no definition of low and middle income housing. No such definition in the proposal. And also in existing zoning, no definitions of either. Very strange absence there. The other thing I started looking for is loopholes. You have to do a loophole analysis of any zoning. And one which has been fairly well known just recently is the 30% open space one. And you can achieve that by doing 15% on with a roof deck and 15% for parking as long as you use unit pavers. No room for trees, no room for grass, no room for... That's the 30%. You've done it. There's the loophole. Another question that comes up is the top page 3, when you ask the question, how does it work? And it says here, the initial sale price of a dwelling unit shall be approved by the Community Development Department. Sales price. Even the assessor has difficulty finding out what the value is of property. And putting that burden on CTD, I think, is a very controversial and difficult one. It involves profit versus nonprofit. The one help you have here is in law, that the law favors nonprofit.
Thank you. We'll take your comments.
Okay.
Carol O'Hare, followed by Peter, I can't read the last name, from Inman Street, followed by Abra Berkowitz. Carol left? Okay. Peter, you're out there? There you are. Followed by Abra Berkowitz, followed by Teresa Brown.
My name is Peter Lawless. I'm at Inman Street in Cambridge. I think like everyone, I'm all for affordable housing in the city, but I prefer...
Could you say your address?
22 Inman Street.
Thank you.
I'm all for affordable housing in the city within the limits set by the city years ago. The height and density and the green space are the issues that make me anxious about this proposal. My concern is that my little condo in a 3-story building can become part of a canyon, and I don't want to live in a canyon. The green space reduction also it concerns me. Our building already floods. The first floor floods when it rains heavily. I suspect because there's no green space anywhere around our building. And even if this overlay passes, and there's, I think I read 1,000 affordable units that are wished to be built with 8 stories or 7 stories or whatever it is, 5 years from now, the city is still, in my opinion, going to be unaffordable to many. And there'll still be people wanting to live here. And I suspect the city will be back here again, seeking to raise the height limits or the density or the green space affected again. And Cambridge will be less a city of people and more a city of towers and concrete. Downtown Boston and New York City are examples, to me, of where this is going. I used my life savings to buy my unit with an understanding that there were height restrictions in the city and presumed green space requirements and density requirements. This understanding related to the quality of life that I thought I'd have in Cambridge. I felt I was baited. I was baited into living in the city with these issues. This overlay proposal, to me, changes the quality of life. To me, it's a switch.
Thank
bait
you.
and switch.
We'll take your comments. Abra, followed by Teresa Brown, followed by David Sullivan.
Thank you, Housing Committee members. My name is Abra Berkowitz. I live at 632 Massachusetts Avenue in Cambridge. I fully support an affordable housing overlay. I do, however, think that we need to really stipulate both kind of the makeup of the units and also start to think about how to adjust the AMI to truly serve the demand. You've heard a lot over the past 3 meetings, and I'm sure before then, that there is a massive, massive demand for low-income units. I know this. I have students who've literally been on the waiting list for a decade. And if that's not demand, I don't know what is. I understand the urge to make sure that folks who have been squeezed out of the city, particularly the middle class, are able to have a place to stay and a place to even grow their families and put their kids in the school system or keep their kids in the school system. But we really need to consider the demand here, and the demand really is for low-income units. I'm fortunate enough to live in a moderate income unit. If I wanted to, I could move to Medford. Maybe I could buy something in Dorchester. I have the option to have a roof over my head. My students, folks I know who've been on this waiting list for 10 years because they're low income, don't have that option. Similarly, I'd like to suggest that we examine the home ownership units. I think that there's too high of a percentage for middle income folks. If we're talking about sustainability, if we're talking about people who are particularly lower income to grow their income, that means that they need to have access to a home ownership unit so that they can take that extra shift or they can get promoted so that they're not in fear of losing their housing because suddenly they're going to make too much and be out of income adjusted rental units. So I really think we should consider both rentals and home ownership units to prioritize low income folks. That's simply where the demand is. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take your comments. Teresa Brown, followed by David Sullivan, followed by Carolyn Shipley. Followed by Michael Pruzak.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is David Sullivan, 16 Notre Dame Avenue, North Cambridge. You've heard from me now a couple times, and I will try not to take too much of your time. I do appreciate all the time that all of you are spending on this, and I want to again thank the CDD staff and the city solicitor for a great job of drafting what I'm sure is a very difficult job. That's the first point I'd like to make. I agree with the previous speaker who said, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. I appreciate all the hard questions that you are all asking. They are very important. I appreciate the detailed comments that are being made by my fellow citizens. But it is important to realize that this is not going to be chiseled in stone. It is something that we should do our best to get right, but that once it is passed, it can be amended. I've spent most of my professional life drafting legislation. I was the state Senate counsel for 10 years. I have never seen a perfect piece of legislation, and I doubt that I ever will. You should keep that in mind. You should do the best you can, but you should not fail to pass something because it is not perfect. Secondly, I also appreciate the fact that several of you have spoken about the importance of more funding for affordable housing. That is very important, and I and people who agree with the pro-housing agenda here strongly support that idea. But it is not enough to say we will spend more money on affordable housing if we don't have a mechanism for finding places to build that housing, and it is a waste of public funds if we don't pass something that makes that housing more affordable for nonprofit developers. Thank you very much for your consideration.
Thank you. We'll take your comments. Carolyn Shipley, followed by Michael Pruzak, followed by Derek Capone.
Good evening. Carolyn Shipley, 15 Laurel Street. I want to say that I encourage the addition of affordable housing. However, like many Cambridge residents, I have some questions and concerns about the terminology of this zoning. It does not mean that I or those other people are against affordable housing. Quite the contrary. I helped two of my friends get affordable housing here in Cambridge, and it wasn't easy. A lot of red tape. But this overlay proposal, which will take away our right to appeal, is dividing Cambridge and causing friction and ill will between neighbors. I was verbally attacked by 3 of these unconditional supporters of this zoning as I left this room on March 20th because they didn't like what I said here in this room. And I have to tell you, I admit, I hate to have to say it, but I had PTSD for a good week after that attack. This is what this proposal is doing, and it won't let us build one more affordable unit than we could do now. So many developers, architects have said that to me. The other problem right now is I'd like to put solar on my roof, but I don't think I could if my neighbor sold his house and someone built another structure 45 feet tall right next to my house because there isn't much clearance. So the city wants us to do solar. I won't be able to do it. I won't be able to plant trees or shrubs or perennials on my property if it's in total shade because of something that's 45 feet tall.
Thank you for your comments.
Thank you very
We'll
much.
take them. Michael Pruzak, followed by Derek Capone, followed by Francis Sullivan, followed by Trudy Goodman.
Oops. Good evening. My name is Michael Pruzak. I live at 8 Austin Park. I'm a 16-year Cambridge resident. I want to add my voice to the citizens who are speaking out against the proposal to throw out existing zoning restrictions. Zoning restrictions are put in place specifically to control unrestricted growth and excessive density and to preserve livability for everyone. As we've come to learn, Cambridge is already the 4th densest city in the United States. We are rated #1 for the worst traffic. Our subway system is old, underfunded, overburdened, and Cambridge is already spending millions of dollars trying to keep up and manage the quickly increasing levels of pedestrians, bicycles, and cars and buses on our already crowded streets. I'm not speaking out against affordable housing. I'm speaking specifically against retrofitting thousands of square feet of new living space with no restrictions on height and density into a city that is already bursting at the seams. The city must come up with other ways to accommodate housing that does not create a development free-for-all, that does not destroy the livability of this city and bury residents in the shadows of 80-foot buildings. I strongly urge the City Council to vote against this zoning proposal. Please go back to the drawing board, take the time to devise an appropriate plan to address our affordable housing needs in a way that doesn't completely exclude people already living here and in a way that doesn't disregard the functioning and livability of our city. Thank you.
Derek Capone, followed by Francis Sullivan, followed by Trudy Goodman, followed by Adrian Musgrave.
So, good evening. The more that I learn about this...
Your name?
Derek Copon, 8 Wright Street. The more I learn about this proposal, the more it seems to me that a lot of people are going to make a lot of money off of this proposal, and it's not really going to help the people that we should be helping. Some members of the board tonight have said that the developers are not going to be getting rich off this proposal, and I really think that when you dig into the details, that's not the case. I've taken an interest in a 100% affordable housing development near me at 1791 Mass Avenue, and I went to the hearing where the developers were showing us their plans. And my understanding of how it works is they get this money from the public to fund capital development and to build for themselves a revenue stream that continues in perpetuity. It looked like they had cut some corners on this development. They didn't put in any parking at all. And I could see doing that if that meant you could get more units, but it looked like the reason they didn't put in parking was just so they didn't have to spend the money to dig out the basement. I asked them why they had not put on solar panels on the roof, and it was just money, even though they have incentives and they could do that. And they're making a lot of money. They were complaining that when they get their fee after completing the development, they were going to be in such a high income tax bracket that they were going to be paying 40% income tax for 2 years. And they were saying that they're going to be, I guess, managing this property for the rest of their lives and maybe handing it on to their children and collecting the rents as their management fees. And so these developers, and this is for people who make 100%, 120% median income. These are not the people who need affordable housing. And so I looked up these developers. One of them is Sean Hope. The other one is Jason Korb. Sean Hope gives money to half the city councilors on the city council. And so as part of this conversation, I would like to see the city councilors stop taking money
Could you
from
please
developers.
just refer the comments to the subject on hand?
I think this is exactly the subject, Developers who benefit from this policy.
Thank you for
are
your
buying influence.
comments. We'll take them. Francis Sullivan, followed by Trudy Goodman, followed by Adrian Musgrave. Sorry, what? Sullivan, 6 Laurel Street. Okay, they're not here. Trudy Goodman, followed by Adrian Musgrave, followed by Noam Tanner.
My name is Trudy Goodman. I live at 1221 Cambridge Street in Cambridge, which is the Emmons Square Apartments. And there's 2 things I really want to talk about. One is there clearly needs to be a plan to deal with this. And there was a woman earlier who said it brought up all the negative emotions for her. I have to tell you, I've lived here for 40 years. My family had a hardware store here from about 1915 to 1968. Okay, so these negative issues and problems between the haves and have-nots have always been here. There needs to be some sort of resolution amongst people about the fact that poor people live here and have always lived here and have a right to live here, and we have a right to live decently in this city. I want to address something that I've addressed before here. It's not enough that we're building these things. Fantastic. I want to know that whoever is building and developing these should be. Now, Charles Franklin spoke earlier, and I have to tell you, some of you people know by the address of what I've given who owns the building that I live in. I would suggest to you that anyone who builds anything here needs to be vetted as to the condition of the buildings that they already own in this city. I invite any of you to walk through my unit and see how it has not been maintained over the last 25 years, and yet this group of people that my landlord represents continues to develop so-called affordable housing here. Here's the thing, if you develop affordable housing that is not good, then you have not changed the issues for people who need affordable housing. You have given us things to live in, like micro units that no one should have to live in. You have given us things that are going to fall apart, and we're going to have to come back to you again.
We'll take your comments. And to the earlier speaker and to everyone in general, there's something in our rules where if we are talking about personalities and so forth, it's prohibited. Adrian Musgrave, followed by Noam Tanner.
Hi, my name is Adrienne Musgrave, and I live at 48 Haskell Street in North Cambridge. I just want to highlight the fact that we had a citywide planning process that has recently concluded, and within that discussion, there was a suggested target goal of 25% of new housing production to be affordable, with at least 3,175 new affordable units by 2030. Right now, we have under 15% of our affordable housing is affordable. We heard tonight from the developers and the organizations that actually build affordable housing, and they said, quite frankly, without the overlay like this, and without some zoning relief, and without the funding, none of those units will be built. And so we're in a catch-22 if we don't pass the affordable housing overlay. And so I hope that folks here can consider the goals that the community process went through and this affordable housing overlay that would make those goals happen. Thank you so much for the comments that the City Council has provided for the feedback and for the leadership on the Housing Committee to bring this to a vote. Thank you.
No? And we'll take your comments if you have them.
All right. Hi. First, I'd like to thank everyone on the council and the development committee for all the time they put into it. My name is Noam Tanner. I live on 47 Sacramento Street, and I support the overlay. Someone here mentioned the issue of not necessarily taking the voices of certain resident associations. I'd like to bring up another group of people, and these are people that work in Cambridge, that want to live in Cambridge, but can't afford to live here. So take, for example, a Harvard dining hall worker who has to live in Brockton and has to potentially commute for over 2.5 hours a day. This is time not necessarily spent helping the family, not necessarily spent learning and getting an education so that they can get a better job. And in addition, this is also very environmentally damaging. So this affordable overlay, even if it might not be perfect, could help accomplish and help this person out and also our environment out in multiple ways. And I love this person to be my neighbor. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And that is it for our public comment sign up. Are there people who said they signed up and haven't been able to speak? And I'm sorry, you did sign up or you didn't? Outside. Okay, we're going to get the sheet. Okay, Patrick Braga, followed by Francis Goyas, followed by Ann O'Connell.
Hi, my name is Patrick Braga, 11 Everett Street. I'm studying urban planning at Harvard, and I have prior professional experience project managing a workforce affordable housing project. I've spoken before at these committees, and I wanted to reiterate my very strong support for the overlay and respond to some misconceptions I heard tonight. First, the dimensional requirements proposed are consistent with prevailing built patterns in Cambridge, and the planning board already only has really an advisory role when projects go to the Board of Zoning Appeals. One of my neighbors tonight mentioned that none of his neighbors support the overlay, but as a proud resident of the Agassiz community, I've had cordial, respectful, and very productive conversations with some of my neighbors, including ones with whom I disagree, and now we greet each other with a smile whenever we cross paths. Third, the height and setbacks are far more accurate predictors of urban form than FAR. 4, micro units are completely fine. I lived in a 305 square foot studio that was spacious, convenient, and well lit a year and a half ago, and loved it. It was exactly what I needed and what my middle-aged neighbor who had been living in his studio for 10 years needed. So yes, micro units can be healthy and meet diverse needs. Next, the 20-foot rear yard requirements will create plenty of open space, and I'd rather have more people living in Cambridge than having people living outside of Cambridge driving and putting more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as they come into our town, our city rather. And finally, the people who would most benefit from the development that would result from this overlay are also people who have the least or are less likely to have free time to come spend the evenings proclaiming their support for the overlay. I strongly support it. Please move it forward. Thank you.
We'll take your comments. Thank you. Francis, followed by Anne, followed by Alexandra.
Hi, everyone. It's my first time speaking here. This is too high. I want to say I also 100% support.
Could you just say your name and address? Thank you.
Francis Goyas, 353 Harvard Street, apartment 22. I think it's around 400 square feet, and we love it. We don't have a backyard, and that's okay, because we have a park that we can walk to, and we have transit near us, and we're well connected to the entire area. And if we had kids, they would go to some of the best schools in the entire country. I want to first start by saying that, like the person that just spoke with me said, a lot of people don't have time to come here after work, especially folks that maybe work 2 or 3 jobs in order to afford to live in Cambridge, a very, very expensive city. Also, data shows that people that attend meetings tend to be older homeowners and usually don't support whatever is being discussed, especially when it comes to housing. Depriving low and middle-income households from access to excellent education, parks, and transit is perpetuating segregation. I also want to say that zoning was in part created to create exclusionary zoning, exclusionary things that deprive primarily non-white households from moving to a place like Cambridge that is full of opportunity. I also want to say that April is National Affordable Housing Month, and it's the 51st anniversary after MLK and the civic right for affordable housing, and I don't think there would be a better month to pass the affordable housing overlay. Thank you.
Anne O'Connell, followed by Alexandra.
Hello, my name is Ann O'Connell, 52 Shepherd Street in Cambridge. I'm a first-time speaker here. 3 short bullet points are, first, please, I'm in general support of the overlay but I hope it goes through a few iterations. Resist the temptation to build parking spaces. You know, we're the #1 city in terms of traffic, take a leadership role, no parking, okay? And maybe everyone could benefit that way. I'd like to see you restore some of the rights to abutters and property owners. I don't feel comfortable not being able to enjoy the legal rights that we have as homeowners. So just if you could tweak that language a little bit. And finally, I was under the impression that zoning means a little harmony in terms of building design. And so if you, as a homeowner, maybe what we should think about is, okay, if I'm going to, and I live in West Cambridge, and there are lots of buildings that are not occupied right now, but if I live next to a building like that, and, you know, it's 3 stories is the current zoning, but it's going to go up to 4, then shouldn't I have the same right to, okay, maybe I can just build a dormer or something? So those are my 3 points, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Alexandra?
Thank you, counselors. I'll keep this brief. I think I'm the last person, and everyone's probably ready to go home. I'd like to voice my support. 6 Laurel Street.
Could you say your name and address? I'm sorry to interrupt.
Alexandra Markievich, 6 Laurel Street. I'd like to voice my support for the overlay, and I'd like to talk about 2 primary reasons here. First, as a couple of folks have already said, we have some of the best access to the region's resources when we're here in Cambridge. We have the Red Line, we have jobs, we have schools, we have parks, and the majority of the traffic that actually comes through Cambridge or the majority of traffic in Cambridge is actually coming through Cambridge. So if we had the opportunity for more folks to actually live here, we'd have less traffic and more people getting access to all of those resources. Second, I'd just like to say that cities change. This is something that we love about cities. This is something that makes them really beautiful and great. I think if we think of all the cities that we love in the world, they have many different types of buildings from many different time periods, and that's a good thing that we value. And here with the overlay, we have a chance to have our city change as we know it will, but in a way that's demonstrably more equitable than if we didn't have it. So, thanks.
Thank you. And Nicola, I see that you've signed up, but there was yes or no, so I wanted to check. Great. Please come on up.
I guess I'm the last person to speak. Good evening. I really appreciate your comments, Councillor Mallon, earlier.
Please say your full name and
Nicola
address.
Williams, sorry. Nicola Williams, 8 Brewer Street, Cambridge. I really appreciate Councillor Mallon's comments and questions. They were really good. And Councillor Zondervan, today I'm speaking on behalf of small retail business owners in Cambridge. I'm on the board of Sustainable Business Network. I'm a business owner for 25 years. I'm members of several business associations and have been a member of the Cambridge Local First. First, I support 100%, I'm in 100% support of a comprehensive affordable housing strategy for Cambridge. And I also think that we need at least $100 million for affordable housing. Specifically, I'm concerned about the purple on this map. Tonight, there were 2 questions. Mayor McGovern asked the question, and I think Councillor Zondervan asked the same question around the purple zone, and there were 2 different answers. So I really plead and ask for clarity and transparency from the city in regards to what's happening with the purple zone. Because my understanding from the purple zone, which is about 1/3 on the map that the city provided, it will provide up to between 80 and 350 feet based on current zoning. That's about 10 to 30 floors. So I just need some clarity around that, because Harvard Square at $300 a square foot with a retail space, an affordable housing developer can make a lot of money.
If you could send your comments, we'll take them.
Thank you.
And with that, I am going to move to, sir, did you sign up for public comment? Page 3, say your name again? Okay, yeah, please, come on forward. So I'll let you speak. So just for prior, I'm going by, it says speaking yes or no, and it says no, and so that's why I skipped over you. It was not an intentional.
Oh, I thought it was, are you in favor of the overlay?
We're going to correct that for next time. Please go ahead.
Does my 2 minutes start now?
Kurt Rogers, Austin Park, Cambridge residents. This is my first time addressing you on this topic. In 1994, I founded a nonprofit in Cambridge that provided housing for homeless domestic violence survivors after being a survivor homeless myself. I then led that organization for over 20 years and have advocated tirelessly to help individuals access housing. I strongly support affordable housing. However, I am adamantly against this affordable housing zoning overlay. It shifts the city from FAR zoning to a radical new zoning process, form-based zoning, which has not been adequately studied. It will destroy the character of streets and neighborhoods by flagrantly surpassing the density and height of the adjoining properties. It eliminates the binding authority, binding sound judgment, and the binding design review process of the zoning board. It inconceivably eliminates neighbors' ability to have a truly meaningful say in any abutting developments, and it removes the abilities for neighbors to sue, which for me is unconscionable. Its reduction of setbacks will have a negative impact on our efforts to maintain some semblance of a tree canopy for the city. It creates an approval process for development that is simply too fast and has scant, if any, authoritative protections against bad results. In a well-intentioned but ill-conceived effort to address affordable housing, it sacrifices a precious resource, quality of life. The Community Development Department admits that little new affordable housing will result from the overlay. With all due respect, this plan is delusional. It's an affordable housing Trojan horse that will spill out developers to sack our city. I implore you, please, to vote against this unbalanced and dangerous proposal. Please spend the time to develop a plan that will have a meaningful impact on affordable housing while not wreaking havoc on the quality of life in Cambridge. Thank you.
Thank you, Kurt. Who else signed up and was not able to speak? Please come forward.
Hello. My name is Annette Lamond. I was the second name on the list, 7 Redazel. I wanted to thank the city councilors. I learned so much tonight. Your questions were excellent. There's one question that I haven't heard yet. There was a reference to the onerous state regulations on going after subsidized money. I'm wondering what the city council could do in terms of working with the state and surrounding communities who have the same affordable housing problems to improve that, to improve the laws, make new legislation, and that could perhaps be a better way than a drastic zoning change. Thank you.
Thank you, and please step forward.
So my name is Justin G. I live at 9 Austin Park, and I've not spoken about this before, but for something that will have such a deep impact on the quality of life in the city, in terms of density and what is built, I'm not in support of this because it is deeply flawed and it's just rushed. So I just ask the city council to look at this and to say, it's so flawed that we cannot support this. So I just ask to consider this because our city here has a process for zoning, and we have rules and regulations, and affordable housing does get built here. So I ask that we respect that process. Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, with that, we'll move to close public comment.
Can you bring her a mic? It might be just as easy. Just a moment. We'll bring a mic to you. You're very welcome.
Hi. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes. My name is Victoria Berglund, and I live in affordable housing. And I'm really very fearful that this is not going to work. I mean, we all have children that have are in the universities, have graduated, and they're still living at home, and they do not want to leave Cambridge because they have so much to offer. My heart goes out to those who are fearful of affordable housing being in their neighborhood. I think they should get out and talk to people other than their neighbors. I wish they could see the light and stop seeing it with gaslight and start using LED. It's really bothering me that, and I'm hoping and praying all works well. I'm starting to stutter, I'm starting to cry, so you don't know how much this affects us. They really, and I would hate to see those who are left in Cambridge to have to leave Cambridge, because this is a beautiful place to live and we all love it. And I'm fortunate enough to live in affordable housing because I couldn't afford to go anywhere else, and I probably would have a breakdown if I would have to move out of Cambridge. And my neighbors, I know all my neighbors, and they're from various parts of the world, and they feel the same way. I mean, they're from Guatemala, they're from Ethiopia, they're from Bangladesh. I know where most of my neighbors are from. And we're surrounded by homeowners.
Thank you for your comments.
Okay.
And with that, I'll move to close public comment and hand it back to my co-chair.
A motion to close public comment having passed. Public comment is now closed. We want to, on behalf of the co-chair and I, we want to thank all of you for coming out this evening. We do want to remind you that on April 9th, there will be a roundtable, although public comment is not, we do not have public comment at roundtables. We do, those that want to come, we please encourage you to come, and it will be televised, or we'll be voting to make sure it's televised at the Monday night meeting. After which, April 16th at 6 o'clock, there'll be a public comment only on the language that is before us now, and then April 25th, there'll be a meeting of the Committee on Housing, of which public comment will also be a part. Again, we want to thank you for your time and your attention. On a motion to adjourn, all those in favor say aye. Opposed? The ayes have it. This meeting is adjourned.